Kids, you're dismissed. You can go to Children's Church at this time. And love you, kids. I love every one of you. And by the way, aren't you glad we have a church full of kids? Amen. Yeah. Now I'm going to tell you something, and I'll say this over and over, and you'll hear it from time and time again. If children that are learning appropriate behavior and children that are trying to discover what to do and how to do and things like that, and if they bother you during church because they're loud or they're doing this, that, and the other, you need to find another church. Amen. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be rude about it or anything else, but I love these kids. And if we don't start investing in our kids, and if we don't start allowing our kids to grow up in this kind of environment, and if we're going to place judgment on them and this, that, and the other, I'm not saying that we're not trying to teach them. I'm not saying that we're not trying to correct them along the way and stuff. But I'm here to tell you that if a child acts up in church, or acts up, I'm talking about being loud, and it makes you a little bit uncomfortable, get over it. Are you listening to me? Get over it, because these children need our influence. And by the grace of God, I will fight for them to my dying day. They need to be in church. They will not be run off from church. They will be encouraged, they'll be developed, and they'll be loved in this church. And I'm hoping I'm talking to you. And I hope you understand that about me. We're in this together. Okay? Family matters. I was going to read a text in Scripture, but I'm not. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you, family matters to God because it always has in the beginning. From Genesis all the way to Revelation, it talks about the importance of family. It talks about how that is encouraged and how that's suffered and how that's rejoiced. It talks about it over and over. From Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel to David and his son Solomon and Absalom. If you don't know who Absalom is, read about David. Absalom was a son that David loved. It's tragic. Read about it. All the way through the parables that Jesus gave, through the examples of the prodigal son. Y'all remember the prodigal son, don't you? Most of you, we take that prodigal son story and we think about the son disobeying the father, calling him as dad, goes off, gets in a pig pen, thinks he's a mess, comes back home, and how the father receives him. We think that's what it's about. And that is true to an extent, but it's much, much more. Much, much more. But in all those stories, in all those parables, God is trying to get a message even deeper that's very obvious, but it's so deep we sometimes miss it. And that is this, that family matters. And you're to do everything within your power to make sure that family matters. It matters when a son goes off in disobedience and he stays gone, for him to come back and return and repent. It matters. It matters that Jesus Christ loved us so much that while we were yet still sinners, He sent His Son to die on the cross to forgive us of our sin, that we can be restored. Family matters to God. It should matter to us. Amen. It should matter to us. But we want to give you some tools of how to understand that. We want to give you some tools to be able to understand how a child speaks, how an adolescent speaks, how an adult speaks, and how an older person in geriatric care speaks. Not care, but geriatrics. That's an age group, by the way. We want you to know, we want to give you some tools. That's why I've asked Janet, because she is an expert in this field. It's why I've asked her to come and talk about the early childhood and talk about adolescence. Today she's going to talk about adults and geriatrics. So we'll have some basic understanding of our developmental process, that we may have the tools to be able to apply some of the aspects, because family matters. Why? Because family matters. Say it with me. Janet comes to speak.
I'm so thankful for my family and God, and I think you got a glimpse of how grateful Steve is. We're very appreciative of you guys, and we push forward with our brothers and sisters in Christ. and developing a stronger and stronger love for God and love for each other. As Steve's asked me to cover adulthood today, just a mere 60 or so years in 10 or 15 minutes, I think it helps us to understand a little bit about our bodies, what we're going through. We are the vessel in which God places the Holy Spirit. And we need to know something about that vessel and how to take care of it. That is truly important, and I think that's not a message that's a message that we're not getting clearly to our younger generations these days. And also, as we strive to love each other, if we understand what we're going through at the various age periods, it's easier to communicate and to understand each other. So if you'll put on your seat belts, we're going to go through a roller coaster from about 20 years up to about 80 or 90 years in just a few moments. To begin with, I want to mention the period that we call emerging adulthood. And these are the years from about 18 to 25. They're definitely years of transition, especially in our culture. We don't have one rite of passage when we qualify someone as an adult. We can vote at 18, we can serve in the military at 18, we may not be able to buy alcohol legally till we're 21. They're all various ages at which we have certain rights, but we in our culture do not have one rite of passage that qualifies us as being an adult. And if you ask young adults in this period of emerging adulthood, many of them will tell you they do not quite feel like an adult yet. They're planning their life course, they're learning those roles and expectations, and they're stressed. Coming out of adolescence, the adolescents that we have these days are feeling terribly stressed because they see the role expectations and they're not sure how to jump into them. We see that these years from about 18 to the mid-20s are not only a period of transition and stress, but they're one of the loneliest periods in the adult lifespan. Many people think that the elderly are the loneliest group, and that is not true. It's in the emerging adulthood years and early adulthood that we tend to experience the greatest loneliness. We may have a lot of contacts in our life, we may be taking on a lot of new roles, but the depth of relationship and the understanding of self is still developing. And that brings me to the matter of trying to project what our life is going to be, what role should we take on, how long are we going to live, and what are we expected to do during that time. And as these young transitioning adults are looking ahead, one thing that they might note is that our life expectancy is now declining in this country. When they think, well, what am I going to do in my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, my 50s? What am I supposed to have accomplished by my 60s and my 70s? Did you know that we are now in a period of declining life expectancy that started in late 2015, 2016? We're losing time because we are not taking care of ourselves. We've got an epidemic of obesity. We're not exercising. We have, as everyone knows, an epidemic of addictions to opioids. And so I want to look at some of the things that are affecting us at each life stage to help us to understand and perhaps make those transitions through the years a little bit better. I also will mention here too, on a negative note, that suicide has soared in our population. We're at a 50-year peak in suicide rates for our culture. And I don't think it would surprise anyone to know that our young adults top that list. This is a period of extreme stress on them, and they feel the loneliness and social isolation, sometimes trying to reach the mark and fit in the goals. But also we have a rise in suicide in the middle adult years. And that's something that we need to look at with open eyes. We need not to be afraid to ask the questions. You will not cause anyone to take their own life by simply asking, are you thinking about killing yourself? But what you may do is open the lines of communication to being able to get them help. And I have placed some resources on the table outside in the hallway to know how to work with a person, to talk with a person if that you think may be at risk of taking their own life. And I would be more than glad to talk with you if you have any of those concerns for yourself or for a loved one. Just do not be afraid to take action Okay? Now, as we move into early adulthood, and for us in the sciences, early adulthood is from about 20 to 40 or 45 years of age. In early adulthood, we're still at our peak of mental and physical functioning. Most of our physical systems, our sensory systems, peak in their functioning in our early 20s. And when they do start to decline, they decline very, very gradually with normal aging. We're in the age strata that we have the highest status, at least in the U.S. Young adults are seen as having it all, and it's the highest status for most adults in our country. We start to, when we get into the early adult roles, we're at first conforming. We're pushed to conform to all the social expectations, and there's a lot of pressure with that. And by the time you get into your 30s and your mid-30s, some of that, those conformist values are starting to give way to being a little bit more individualistic. You feel a little bit of a sense of relief by the time you get in your 30s. You've met some of the milestones for stepping out into the adult world, and you can start to be a little bit more of an individual by the time you're in your 30s. We do have what we call the boomerangers, the young adults that leave home, and technically they're qualified as the young adults who leave home for at least 4 months and then they return. And that's over half of our young adult population in this country at this time. You may ask, who is the most upset when the boomerangers return home to the parents' house? Is it the parents or is it the offspring? And it's the offspring who are more upset. They are more uncomfortable with it by far than even the parents. And there are strong cultural differences in this. If we look at subcultural differences in our country, the African American families, the Latino families, put more emphasis on living together and having extended generations within the same household. They don't look down on it perhaps as much as do the non-Latino whites. There are vast subcultural differences in this. We also, most of us, if we are going to marry, encounter marriage, enter into marriage for the first time in early adulthood. And there are a few things that I think young couples need to be aware of when they enter into marriage. That first year we call the honeymoon period. First 12 months, the honeymoon period. And when difficulties arise, as they will, typically there's still so much romantic and physiological attraction that we can overcome the rough spots. But by the time we get into the second, third, fourth, and fifth years, this is the stage of a marriage where the stress for most people starts to build. As they're trying to work on joint goals, family traditions, who's going to sacrifice for the other, children start coming into the picture. And if most young couples knew that this is a high-stress time where people not only value marriage, but at the same time they resent it because they feel like they're losing their individuality. That's a normal feeling. It's not a time to ditch the relationship. It's a time to dig in and dig more deeply for the commitment and the communication. The qualities that seem to hold a marriage together during these years are, first of all, fondness, expressing fondness and admiration for your partner. When you're going through the stressful times, making sure to communicate fondness and an awareness of what the other person's doing. Whether they're out working long hours and missing time with the family, or whether it's a parent staying at home and getting up with a baby at night. You might not be able to take the stress of the chores away, but simply acknowledging to a partner that I do know what you're doing and I admire you for it goes a long way in saving and solidifying a marriage. Perhaps the number one thing that marks a marriage as being successful or unsuccessful, of being at risk, is the ratio of the pleasing interactions relative to the displeasing interactions. Any relationship is going to have some negative or displeasing interactions. And I don't simply limit that to saying curse words or yelling or slapping or hitting. But a negative interaction is simply insulting someone, not being polite, frowning, giving them a look of disgust. Anytime the ratio of pleasant interactions to negative interactions starts to equal out, that's a warning sign. That relationship is at high risk for failing. And I say this because this is something that we can learn to improve upon, all of us. Not necessarily by giving superficial positive feedback to someone, but just simply learning to be aware of our actions and our words, smiling, saying please, saying thank you, saying I love you, I appreciate what you just did. And that's something we can all work on. A good marriage has agreed upon their rules for disagreeing. And most of us don't like to enter relationships by talking about how we're going to disagree, but we will. And in the strongest of marriages, they sit down and consciously talk about how we will agree to disagree. What are the rules? What is allowed and what is not allowed? And in times when there's intense passion, intense anger, and you realize I'm not thinking clearly, I'm so aroused and worked up, perhaps it is good to walk away for a few minutes. Problem avoidance never solved anything. And I'm not talking about avoiding something by going off to the mall or going to mom's house for the weekend or going fishing with the buddies and ignoring the problem. But when we get so worked up emotionally that we can't think straight, perhaps walking away to the other side of the house or taking a walk outdoors for 20 to 30 minutes till the body physiologically comes back down and you can think straight, that's a good tactic. Because it will take 20 or 30 minutes for the body to calm down, for you to be able to control your emotions and to think logically. A couple that's working on a strong marriage will be roughly matched on their levels of self-disclosure. How much they like to talk, how much they like to talk to each other about their feelings, their emotions, what happened during the day. That needs to be balanced out. They need to roughly match each other so that one's not feeling extremely stressed and burdened by the other's activities. And then good marriages are ones in which the couple tells each other that they're their best friends, and they truly are best friends. We can maintain some of our individuality, but typically the spouse is the best friend, and they like spending leisure time together. If you don't spend leisure time together, you're not building relationship, and you may be growing apart. They experience communication in a very positive, proactive way where they engage in what's called active listening. And active listening is just a technique where you hone in, you show someone that you are listening to them, you put down the phone, you put down the paper, you make eye contact, and then you listen and you repeat back what the person said to make sure that you understood, that you got it correct. Because oftentimes we don't understand correctly, and we take off on tangents that may create misunderstandings, and we didn't understand what the person meant. In active listening, you listen, you repeat back before you answer anything, before you pass judgment, and make sure that you're talking about the same thing when you're having a conversation. And then you validate that person, that they do have a right to feel the way they feel. Then you can move on with your discussions. And lastly, with regards to relationships, particularly early in marriages, oftentimes couples get in these cycles that it's called a crazy cycle. Dr. Eggerichs talks about this in his book on love and respect, that a woman's strongest need is for love. Not to say she doesn't need respect from her partner, but she needs love. And a man's strongest need in a marriage is for respect. Not that he doesn't need love, but he needs to be shown and to be felt that he's respected. And sometimes, oftentimes, a woman will criticize her husband, tell him what to do, give him helpful criticism, and he interprets this as negative criticism, that he's not getting the respect he deserves. She may not have meant it that way, but she doesn't understand his need for respect. And when he feels like he's being criticized and not respected, oftentimes he will pull away emotionally. He will shut down, or what we call stonewalling. He won't show any emotion. When he does that, she then feels that he doesn't love her. So she starts to complain and criticize even more. And they get involved and entangled in this crazy cycle, which will only continue to spiral down. So a husband and wife need to know what each other's strongest needs are. He must validate her and show her unconditionally that she is loved, and she must respect him as the head of the household, as her protector, as the covering that carries along in those roles so much responsibility and burden. And then there comes the topic of sex, something we don't talk about very often in the church. And yet, if you're going to talk about the whole person, you have to talk not only about the mind, the emotions, the physical being and the spiritual being, but our sexual relationship is part of what makes us human. And it has to be kept in balance with all the other aspects. And I think a lot of the issues that we get into in today's society is that we have tried to separate sex from emotion and cognition and commitment and spirituality. We take it out of context, and it should be looked at within that context in balance and relationship. It might surprise you that our younger adults, the millennials, those who were born from about 1980, 81 up until the mid or late 90s, our millennials are actually reporting having less sex than previous generations. They are so stressed by jobs. Many of them are having to move back home with parents. They're spending times in groups rather than couples oftentimes. Do we still have a problem with not respecting sex within the marriage? Certainly we do. Do we still have one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates in the industrialized world? Yes, we do. But it might surprise you that our young adults, our millennials, are having less sex than previous generations for many decades. The highly educated married couples are also one of our groups who are having less sex than ever before. Why are our highly educated married couples having less sex than before? It seems to be that one of the big reasons is that they're taking their social media to bed with them. They're taking their work to bed with them. They're taking their smartphones, their computers. They're not putting them down. They're not looking each other eye to eye and communicating. And it in many ways is hurting relationship. And then lastly, something that's not talked about very often within the context of the marriage, and particularly in early adulthood, sex is something that we all feel like we know what we're supposed to be doing, and everybody has it, and it's supposed to be great, and you're not normal if you're not. We're trying to fill social expectations, and yet we don't talk about it. And sex is different for everyone. Everyone's drive is different. It's different for everyone. It's something that couples need to be openly communicating and talking about. And one thing that even amongst strong couples that doesn't get talked about often is pain during sexual intercourse. And if you look at the research, as many as a third of all women will experience intense pain at some point in having sexual intercourse with their husbands. And yet they don't talk about it because they are afraid that their spouse won't understand. And oftentimes it leads to avoidance and a gap in the relationship. And that's something that both husband and wife need to be able to address, and it's something that medical science has started to look into more these days. It can happen with males or females, but it happens more frequently with females. And there needs to be open discussion of that. Parenthood hits during early adulthood for many, and yet at least as many as 1 in 6 couples will experience infertility. We don't realize that infertility is as widespread as it is, but we need to be aware of what others may be dealing with around us. Young parents oftentimes try to save cost on outside child care by engaging in shift work. At least half of young parents with young children are involved in shift work, either because they're trying to save cost or they may not have a choice with the jobs that they have. And there's one word of warning here, is that shift work can really do a lot to cover up bad marriages and communication problems. You have to go the extra mile when a couple is not spending time together, leisure time together, and nights together. You have to go the extra mile to be able to make sure you're communicating for the marriage first, and then to be able to be good parents secondly. In middle adulthood, which is what we call from about 40 to 65 years of age, our biological clock starts to become audible, especially for women if we haven't completed childbearing, if we wanted to. We have some biological changes. Our vision starts to change a bit. By our mid-40s, most people need, they may not get them, but they need to get reading glasses. The lens of our eye gets thick and the muscles that bend it get a little bit weaker. We start being bothered a little bit more by glare. Our eyes don't dark adapt quite as quickly as they do for young adults. It's harder for us to discriminate some of our colors. Our blues and blacks and grays kind of start to blur in a bit during that period. We don't become colorblind, but some of those colors get to be a little bit more difficult to make out. In terms of our hearing, we start to lose a little bit of our ability to hear some of the higher pitches. We start to be bothered a little bit more by background noise. And it's a little bit harder for us to make sense of speech, especially when there's a lot of background noise. Noisy restaurants, parties, receptions. And particularly by the time a person gets in their 50s and 60s, it's best if you can take them to the side or a corner to have an intimate conversation, so they won't be as bothered by the background noise. Sometimes we start to speak a little too loudly, thinking we're going to overcome that problem with understanding speech. And we particularly do this with our elderly adults. And yet when we start to talk so very loud and slowly, it becomes somewhat absurd, and we lose the prosody, the rhythm, the intonation of the language. And when you start to do that, you're taking away all of the other cues that that person who's hard of hearing might be taking advantage of to understand you. Don't yell at each other. Just raise your voice a little bit and keep the inflections. Turn towards a person and let them see your body language. Get rid of the background noise. And we continue to communicate very well. Our immune system slows down a bit. We start to have a few more problems with autoimmune disorders. Heart attack and stroke start to be the #1 killers. We don't get enough exercise, and we forget that exercise is not just for the heart, but it's for the brain, because if we don't blow the blood vessels out, blow the pipes out a little bit more often, we're not getting enough oxygen to the brain. And then our social clock becomes a little bit less significant. And we find in terms of personality, we become much more self-confident, assertive, and individualistic by the time we get into middle age. The younger ones think quality of life is going down, and yet middle-agers will tell you their life satisfaction has increased. It's not negative. Satisfaction with work and marriage increases. And lastly, with the middle-agers, we do start to experience the generational squeeze. If you're lucky enough to still have your parents, you may be caring for parents as well as your offspring. And it's the one time in life where you're going to be squeezed between the generations, and that's the one thing that can particularly cause stress for these. Lastly, to finish up with late adulthood, we start to call people old when they reach 65, and that's not because of any inherent major changes physically or cognitively. That goes back to FDR's legislation for Social Security, the Social Security Act. You had to be 65 before you could draw full Social Security. The major changes in our body, in our mind, the slowing down really doesn't occur for most people until your mid-70s or so. And what we find there is that the things that really protect your mind as you go through middle age and older age is exercise, a balanced diet, Sleep. Sleep is when the brain cleanses itself. It's when it builds proteins that it needs to communicate, and many of us are not getting enough sleep. Nostalgia, being able to look back with positive affect, to feel good about those things in your past that make you feel like you have achieved and you can move forward positively. Those things help us to move forward and to keep achieving and moving forward. And then lastly, relationship. Relationship is probably the biggest thing that contributes to our cognitive health and our longevity. We've studied what are called the blue zones throughout the world, places where people tend to live longer and where men actually tend to live as long as women. And the biggest difference that we see in the blue zones are that people spend an enormous amount of time in fellowship relating to each other. We need that social interaction. Love God and love each other. Love your neighbor. That's what sustains a long and healthy life. And be aware, as you have elderly parents, friends, colleagues, that sometimes because of physical impairments or sensory impairments, they may not be able to interact the way they once did. Don't let them become physically isolated or even isolated within the crowd because they can't hear or see well. Because that fellowship and that social interaction is what builds our happiness and our longevity and brings us together as brothers and sisters in Christ. That's 60 years in a nutshell. Maybe there was something, a nugget there that you could use. Thank you.
Well, I found out something today. I'm a middle-ager, and that's encouraging. And you know, Lynn's just old, but anyway. Yeah. I hope this has been helpful to just give you some highlights about where we are in our developmental stages and how we can relate and see each other as well. Again, these are just they're designed to give you some tools and information about development and how that we can love each other, how we can support each other, how we can encourage one another. And again, raising children and being a family, all these has to do with understanding where you are. If I try to treat you at the wrong stage of development of where you are, then I'm not going to accomplish my goal. My goal is to love you, right? I need to know how to love you. And this is what our goal was today. So, are you glad you came to church today? I am too. Hey, y'all want some banana pudding? Anybody want any banana pudding? I'm glad you don't, because you're not going to get any. But anyway, because I love you, I just want to keep you healthy. But anyway, thank you so much for your honor today, and I just can't tell you how much you have blessed me today. And I hope you've received a blessing by being here. We've got a lot of things going on in the life of the church. We have a lot to do to reach our community and to continue to love each other and spur each other on to good works. And I'm excited that I'm at a place called Friendship North. Amen. To be able to worship with you, to grow with you, to love with you, and experience life with you. Y'all are very special. And I thank you, each and every one.
Thanks for watching. We would love for you to connect with us online. On our website, you will find up-to-date information about everything happening around here. Look for us on Facebook and Instagram. And please, download our free app on your smartphone or tablet. We are so glad you're here, and we hope you enjoy your friendship experience.